Welcome to the Manhattan Institute's event on Opportunity Zones. I'm Michael Hendrix, Director of State and Local Policy here at MI. Opportunity Zones are a bipartisan effort to encourage long-term investments in distressed communities across the country. Now, Opportunity Zones have had their fair share of critics, and there's a new administration in office. So this seems like a great time to discuss what exactly Opportunity Zones are, what lessons we've learned along the way, and where we can go from here. Now we have a fantastic panel to discuss these questions, and please share your questions on whatever platform you're watching us on, and I'll wrap them in as we go. So first up from our panel is Shay Hawkins, the president and CEO of the Opportunity Funds Association and a former tax and trade counsel to Senator Tim Scott, who co-sponsored the original Opportunity Zones legislation. He and his organization worked to connect capital with underserved communities across America. Next, we have Jerron Smith. He's the CEO of the Center for Advancing Opportunity and a former deputy assistant to the president for domestic policy. The Center for Advancing Opportunity supports students and faculty at historically Black colleges and universities in developing solutions for fragile communities. That's a theme that you'll hear throughout this discussion. And last but certainly not least, John Persinger. John is the CEO of the Erie Development Corporation, which is working to transform the downtown core of Erie and spark revitalization across the region. Previously, John worked as a lawyer and embassy attaché in Australia and in the White House counsel's office. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Jerron, I want to start with you. Help us to all get on the same page. What are opportunity zones?
Sure. So opportunity zones are designated low-income census tracts that are designated by governors for each state. These census tracts historically have high poverty levels and high unemployment levels. And in those zones, individuals are able to defer their taxes, their capital gain taxes. And the longer that they have those investments in those zones, they get additional incentives. Those incentives include a 10% step up and a 15% step up if a person was to keep those investments inside those zones for 5 to 7 years. And then there's a total capital gain forgiveness for investments over 10 years. And so essentially the tool is leverage to bring the private sector to the table to invest dollars the way the local government think is best. And so it's a real opportunity to localize revitalization solutions, rather it be building affordable housing or creating a new manufacturing plant. The opportunity zones allows for the private sector market to make investments to low-income areas and for local leaders to work with the private sector to figure out a revitalization strategy that works best for their locality. That's why we turned a lot of the decision making on what zones should be picked or carved out to the governors. But the governors only could carve out those census tracts that had those high unemployment rates, and the CDFI has designated certain areas around the country which are considered low-income census tracts, and that was the area where the governors had to play in. And since then, we've seen a lot of investment, over $75 billion worth of new investment into these zones over the last 3 years.
So the idea, if I get this right, is to prioritize public capital, to localize the focus of that capital, to incentivize that capital to stick around. Is that kind of the fundamental idea behind opportunity zones? Why distressed communities in the first place? I mean, what's the idea and why distressed?
So I would change one verbiage there. It's private capital. This is capital that comes from the private sector, where we're only talking about capital gains. And so that's investment capital that's out there. And we look at it as a tool. It's not a fix-all for a lot of the issues that localities have to deal with. But we think that it's extremely important that for the public sector to put a strategy together, they need to bring the private sector to the table. Like, to be totally honest, we've seen the government try to do it alone. Before the Trump administration, the Obama administration had the promise zones, and promise zones worked really well. However, they couldn't get the private sector capital to really come in, and that's where a lot of the resources are at. And so what we did with opportunity zones becoming law, it allowed for the private sector to step up. And under the Trump administration, one focus that they had was putting federal investment alongside that private sector investment. And what we've seen the most success is where the state and local leaders have done the same. And then you have all partners at the table, the private sector, the public sector on the state, federal, and local level. And that's where you've seen a lot of the most success with opportunity zones.
Shay, how did we get opportunity zones in the first place? What's the story behind this?
Sure. So the opportunity zones provision in the tax reform bill was developed from a bipartisan bill called the Investing in Opportunity Act. That act had 44 House co-sponsors, Democrats and Republicans, 44 Democrats, 44 Republicans, so 88 on the House side, 14 on the Senate side, Democrats and Republicans. They were brought into the bill 2 by 2 by design to make it a bipartisan effort. And so that policy was developed by Senator Tim Scott, my old boss, in connection with Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey, and a think tank really helped push the effort forward called the Economic Innovation Group. And so they developed this tool with the idea of bringing private capital into distressed areas because there's only so much money in a government till, but there's trillions of dollars of investment capital out there on the sidelines that could be brought into distressed communities. And so when tax reform came around, that gave us the, no pun intended, opportunity to get the Investing in Opportunity Act drafted into law. So in working with Senator Scott, we drafted the Opportunity Zones provision pretty much whole into the tax reform bill. One unfortunate fact is in the process of tax reform, we used a process called budget reconciliation, which puts us in a position where any provision in a given bill can be challenged if it doesn't meet the specific narrow budget reconciliation criteria. And unfortunately, it became clear that the minority at the time was going to challenge the reporting and transparency requirements that were built into opportunity zones as not meeting that strict budget criteria. And so we had to remove those so that the entire opportunity zone provision wasn't removed from tax reform. And so we had to remove those and then structure a bill later, which resulted in the Scott-Sinema-Grassley Impact Act to add those provisions back plus some. But we basically took the Investing in Opportunity Act and just filtered it right, almost whole, into the tax reform bill.
So you gave us the Washington perspective, Shay, but you're not in Washington anymore now, right? You're outside of Washington. What are you seeing and how states are implementing opportunity zones? And give us a flavor of the kind of places they're working in.
We're seeing some really exciting things all across the country, from here in Ohio to California, to Erie, Pennsylvania. And so, one of the things that Jerron mentioned is that when we structured this policy, we gave governors 3 main criteria for how they picked the zones. One, we wanted them to pick areas where there was a significant need, places that had seen economic disruption from outsourcing or technology changes or other changes. Second, we wanted to have them pick areas where there was great potential for investment. So a place where you could turn $1 into $10. And finally, we asked them to look for areas where they were mutually reinforcing state local or federal policies. And one of the things that we've seen is that that's allowed folks like John to actually stack, as Jerron mentioned, stack multiple policies on top of one another. So complementary policies like new markets tax credits and opportunity zones, or local tax incentives or things along those lines. Also, you can look at other private sector investment that's not necessarily capital gains oriented. So we've seen states in their policy take some great steps. Here in Ohio, investors get an additional 10% income tax credit on their state income tax for all of their investments in Ohio's 320 opportunity zones. In other states, you see places like Washington, D.C. and Maryland, where most of their opportunity zones are clustered around Baltimore. And there, things like gentrification can be a concern. So those states and the city of D.C. have set aside millions to support job training and affordable housing. So that the existing residents of the communities can actually benefit directly from the jobs that are created. So that's the job training piece, but also so that there's affordable housing supported, so that folks can afford to remain in their neighborhoods as that capital comes in and revitalizes those very neighborhoods. So we're seeing things that are exciting.
I mean, it just sounds like an incredible variety. So John, I want to turn to you. What do opportunity zones look like for you, where you are on the ground?
So opportunity zones are helping us revitalize one of the poorest zip codes in America. I'm sitting in downtown Erie, where the median income in 16505 is just over $10,600. And so our organization was formed in 2017 to revitalize the downtown core. And our board organizations did an incredible job of raising just over $27 million to start this work. But when I and my team were hired in 2018, we quickly realized a few things. One, $27 million wasn't enough. We needed just over $100 million to help turn around a part of downtown. And two, we needed to do this quickly. Erie, like many post-industrial communities, has suffered from years of economic and population decline. And so we don't have a day, we don't have a week to wait, and we needed to do something now. We need to do something big. We need to do something bold to transform our downtown core. So with the $27 million that has been raised by our board organizations, we've been able to leverage that. What we're looking at, just over $100 million of investment into real estate in the downtown. And we're doing this over the next 3 years. We're targeting 12 properties that are a combination of new construction or the revitalization of historic mixed-use properties. The majority of these existing properties were vacant and had been vacant for decades, which is the story of many communities in the upper Midwest. And with these new spaces, we're going to have just over 477,000 total square feet of new or revitalized buildings. We're going to have room for 25 new businesses, which will create more than 300 new jobs. We're going to be bringing a grocery store to a USDA designated food desert. And we're going to be creating short-term jobs through all the construction that's going on right now. So it's really a dramatic turnaround it will be a dramatic turnaround for our downtown core. And as I mentioned, it's possible because of, one, our board organizations leading with $27 million, two, opportunity zones, the incentives being able to attract additional private capital, and three, what's great about opportunity zones is you just need projects and you need capital gains that want to invest in those projects, and you can go. We here in Erie haven't had a new market tax credit deal. We haven't had any low-income housing tax credit deals. So for communities, smaller communities, rural communities, regional communities that haven't been the beneficiaries of these federal government programs, opportunity zones is really making a difference.
So in your story, I hear much of what Jerron and Shay have been describing as the program actually working out in reality. I'm curious how much is new, so new because of opportunity zones, and how much would have happened already, and opportunity zones just simply spur these projects or these investments along.
So what Jerron and Shay talked about is really what you're seeing unfold here in Erie. We had in 2016 a comprehensive plan that was done for the city, and then our organization was spawned out of that comprehensive plan. The plan recommended the need to turn around our downtown properties. Again, many are blighted, vacant, abandoned, underutilized. And that's why our local CEOs and philanthropic leaders raised this $27 million to do this work. But as I mentioned earlier, $27 million wasn't enough. So we're able to leverage the $27 million for just over $100 million. And we're able to do it in a much quicker timeline. Our board had some consultants before I was hired, and they had laid out a very methodical plan to turn around the downtown. A lot of that was reliant on some of these traditional tax credit programs, new market tax credits, low-income housing tax credits. Well, those are programs, and you have to apply, and you have to wait to hear, and then you have to be awarded. And so when you're dealing with programs, there are specific timelines that are set for you by the state or federal government. But as I mentioned, with opportunity zones, we're able to do this work now. We're able to do it today and not wait around for someone in Harrisburg or someone in DC to sign off and award us some tax credits and bless our projects. So opportunity zones really are making a tremendous difference here in downtown Erie.
That's a great point on waiting for someone in a state or a national capital to act. Sometimes that can take forever. And as you said too, reporting requirements can be and applications can be burdensome. Shay, I want to get back to you. So thinking big picture here. So we know what opportunity zones are. Now let's look at what's happening now. Are opportunity zones working? And what should work mean?
Right. So from our perspective at the Opportunity Funds Association, we define success in opportunity zones as the existing resident of opportunity zones benefiting economically either through increased property values, through job creation, through access to goods and services that weren't previously available, and through higher quality of life from opportunity zones. So we want existing residents to benefit. And so to that end, we're seeing some very positive developments in opportunity funds. As of a year ago, right at the start of the pandemic, we still had $10.8 billion that was sitting in opportunity funds ready to be deployed. And obviously all of that capital as it goes out is further leveraged and complemented. And so there's no question that over the next 10 years, you're going to see tens of billions of dollars come into these zones. The question is whether or not the existing residents benefit. And, that's going to be a matter of implementing and restoring the reporting requirements associated with opportunity zones that are critical in having us track the investments in opportunity zones to an extent and having us be able to evaluate this very question of whether or not the existing residents are benefiting. But it's also going to be critical that that local governments create an environment and that the federal government be supportive, as the past administration was, of opportunity zones with complementary legislation. And then finally, it's going to be critical that the actual investment community have the impact on existing residents at the top of mind. And so in every one of those three categories, everything we're seeing is encouraging.
And your point on reporting requirements does get to something that we'll cover in greater depth later in the conversation on where do we go from here? How can we make the program even better? And by the way, for everybody watching, please again enter your questions and whatever platform you're watching. and I'll incorporate them into our discussion. So Shay, I just want to stay with you for just a moment. So present company excluded, who's doing, in your opinion, opportunity zones right? What governors or mayors stand out to you?
Oh wow, that's a tough question because so many folks in both parties have great appreciation for this policy and its potential. So there's so many that have a great appreciation. I know in terms of the selection of zones, I know South Carolina's governor did a really great job, and they had a really great process. Basically, what their priority was they wanted to make sure that every county in South Carolina had at least one opportunity zone, and they had every county government work with the local governments in their county to rank the top census tracts in their county. And so that way, the economic development team there could go through and have a justification for why each zone was chosen. You know, you could say, okay, third choice of Charleston County, or first choice of Greenville County here, was chosen. And so it was a great process, and the result of that type of process, was very effective. South Carolina's population is about 30% Black, 5% other, and the majority, and then the rest, majority white. And so the residents of the opportunity zones that were ultimately chosen were 48% Black, 5% other, and in the remainder majority, majority white. And so, and the other interesting result was that South Carolina, at the time the zones were being chosen, had only one Democratic representative in Congress, and the rest were all Republicans. So the majority of the opportunity zones in the state of South Carolina are actually clustered in that one Democratic representative's district. And so, rather than have the governor do a political process, because he was actually in political cycles, so you would imagine there would be an incentive to do it politically, to kind of put the zones in areas where you think people are going to vote for you. By doing the process in an objective way, they had a positive result in terms of the representation in the zone, but also a positive result in terms of the zones being not political, but just based on those criteria. Where's the money needed? Where can it be most effectively used? And where are there those reinforcing local policies?
Jerron, I'll put you on the spot. I have another question for you, but do you agree on the South Carolina assessment by Shay? Any others stand out to you?
Sure. I mean, the one thing I appreciate about the process about opportunity zones, it put a lot of accountability on localities. And so you've seen different strategies, and with reporting requirements, we can be very transparent on what's working and what's not working. The thing about opportunity zones, it wasn't always about making something perfect. It's about doing something intentional that's actually going to actually move the needle. And that's what it did. It definitely put a lot of accountability on local governments, and those local governments that were intentional, and also chose to collaborate with the state and local government and the private sector are really moving the needle. And so where I've seen that work fantastically is also in Alabama. You have a governor, Republican governor, who work with local leaders like Mayor Randall Wolfen in Birmingham, who created the Birmingham Inclusive Growth Opportunity Fund, a fund that allows for local people to have a say on what type of investments come into their communities. And so that, with them also working with the federal government, you had a public alliance of sorts that worked all the way down to the local level And they were like one of the first communities to see social impact projects coming to fruition. And after getting one project done, that you've now seen a domino effect of them working on the second or third project throughout the city. And so we've used that as like when we're in the Trump administration, we use that as the poster child of how we can do and what's the promise of opportunity zones. The one thing that I regret, opportunity zones passed really fast in the tax reform bill. And one critical piece of it was the rules related to opportunity zones. And that took almost 2 years for us to finalize. And because of that backlog, the easiest investments got done first. And what was most easy was real estate. And so when you hear people talk about it having a focus on real estate, that's the reason, because there was a lot of uncertainty around the rules related to private equity and fund managers that would invest in small businesses. But once that rulemaking was finalized, we saw a huge increase of investment into business enterprises. But the beauty of opportunity zones, even with that 2-year delay, since it's a 10-year economic development incentive, then everyone's looking at the longer term. And so it's still a lot more time for individuals to take advantage of it. But I can't impress this more. It really, really needs local imprint on it if you really want to have that social impact, because the local laws are so different around the country. If you're talking about things like gentrification, things like zoning, and things and rules around taxing areas that have increased property values, all play a role into things like displacement. But then you have other areas where housing and real estate aren't the biggest issues. It's jobs or small business growth. And so we hope that Congress continue to look at that, the promise that opportunity has with its flexibility, but maybe do more work to create more transparency that would incentivize the private sector to, like my colleague just mentioned, keep the people in mind first with these investments. Because there's a way to do well and do good at the same time. And that's what Opportunity Zones is all about.
Yeah, well said. I mean, there has been criticism of opportunity zones, but it does make me wonder, Jeroen, like what the right critiques are, because you could say rightfully the rulemaking process took a long time. And so, that affects the kind of investments that are prioritized up front. But as you also mentioned, some of the critiques could rightly be directed not so much at opportunity zones themselves, but local zoning laws, for instance. I mean, are there other kind of right critiques or wrong critiques that come to mind?
No, I mean, I think all of those are valid. One critique, I'll just be totally transparent about, the incentive got politicized. This was very bipartisan in nature, as Shay mentioned, but because it was a part of the tax reform and jobs cut and tax bill that the Trump administration signed into law, many urban areas that were locally controlled by Democratic members stayed away from it, or individuals in smaller localities weren't at the table when their area got designated, so they didn't know how to really use the tool. And so it took almost 2 years just educating individuals about the incentive, and it's still a lot more educating to do. I think that the true fact is that it's a tool. It's not like a fix-all. There's a lot of different things dealing with the revitalization of a community, a lot of community development pieces, such as public safety, or things like mental health, or issues like access to education, which isn't all just focused on development and things dealing with access to capital. However, you can partner a strategy that you have for developing a safer community with private sector investment to create jobs in those communities that have less crime, or create more mixed income communities to give more to the school districts. And so what we're asking, and I think the right way to look at this, is putting accountability on what's the strategy for that locality. How do we turn this around? Because the fact of the matter is, most of these localities have been distressed for 30 years, 40 years, and no one's really taken a look at it. But when you hear stories like Erie, all of a sudden, the stars align. You have individuals that's focused on revitalizing their community, and then you have an incentive that allows them to do it quickly instead of delaying it for 10 years. Then you're seeing the shovel hitting the ground and things beginning to move in those communities, and that's what it's really all about.
John, I think this is a cue for you. I mean, are you seeing that tension between investment and impact, between whether we're investing in real estate or small business, whether or not a community has a strategy once this program comes along?
Well, I had the opportunity to appear before the House Ways and Means Committee last fall, a year and a half ago now, and I applauded them. I said the genius of this legislation is that it leaves so much up to the local actors, and you don't have people in Washington, D.C. telling us what we can or cannot invest in with some guardrails. We here, as I mentioned, we had a city comprehensive plan that targeted the need to revitalize our downtown core. It was focused on the blighted, abandoned, vacant properties that, to Geron's point, had been blighted and vacant and abandoned for 30, 40 years. And so the flexibility in the legislation allowed us to attract opportunity zone investments. But we are not alone. There are other organizations, there are businesses that are attracting opportunity zone investments. So we are seeing it across the board here in Erie. And the important thing, though, that I think is often overlooked is that investments into real estate do create jobs. We have 160 people working on our construction site right now. And those are people who live in this community, people who are, as I told our local elected officials, they're paying property taxes, they're putting their kids in the public schools, they're shopping at the local grocery stores and the restaurants. So just having investments into real estate is making an impact in our community as well.
Yeah, and there's something that Geron mentioned too about how you can have these dollars flowing into communities. You can have coordination between different levels of government, between public and private. But isn't a distressed community still going to be distressed if the streets aren't safe? The schools are poor, the parks are deteriorating. This is a question that we got from the audience. I mean, there's got to be some kind of coordination here with local authorities on things like that, schools, safety, and the like. And maybe there's even a role for opportunity funds to also encourage that. Is that right?
Well, I'm happy to take this one because I think we are a great example of where our smaller town size played to our advantage. In Erie, everyone knows everyone. There's no 6 degrees separation. There's maybe 2 or 3 degrees of separation. So we were able to move pretty quickly as a community when local leaders saw that the governors had a certain time period in which to designate the zones. We didn't want to leave it up to someone in Harrisburg to select our zones. We wanted to advocate to the governor's office the zones that we needed. And they were focused on our downtown and Bayfront, which, as I mentioned before, a majority of the public and private investment was going to happen. And it also focused on a industrial park in a majority minority neighborhood where they need to see more jobs. And so we were coordinated, we were strategic. We worked in a bipartisan fashion with our Republican state senator and our Democratic mayor and our Democratic county executive to advocate to our Democratic governor as to the zones that we wanted to see here in Erie.
And Shay, I want to stay on this question for just a little bit. Do you see a role? You work with these opportunity funds all the time. Is there a role for opportunity funds to encourage the right policies that would make kind of the broader growth environment happen? Or is that really the responsibility of, say, the local governments or the state government, and opportunity funds need to stay focused?
Right. Well, I can tell you that, a lot of our members have, a dual mission, if you will. And so we have members that, on the real estate side do, one of our members focuses on luxury hotels. So they do one luxury hotel, one affordable housing facility, one luxury hotel, one affordable housing facility. And so, through, their actual investment portfolio, but also through some of the things that they were doing even before opportunity zones were in existence, with their employees as they grow. They kind of have that dual mission. We don't have any members that focus specifically on those kind of on advocating on those kind of traditional government functions, like public safety, for instance. But they do emphasize that, for their investments to be successful, the communities have to be communities of choice, as it were. That's a term that one of our members uses very, very frequently. And so that is to say that, hey, we want to come here, we want to do this project here, we want to build this business here. But our employees and and thereby our investment, needs to be safe.
And we're getting a lot of questions from the audience on success metrics. Shay, maybe you have a sense of this. Where do you go to get a sense of, how new funds are working and what zones are working, how well and where, how much capital has been deployed? Is there a central location for that, or state? Is it state by state? What does that look like?
Sure. And so, what we want is this Congress and this administration to pass the Impact Act, which was a bill that was co-sponsored by Senator Sinema from Arizona, Senator Scott from South Carolina, and at the time, Finance Committee Chairman Chuck Grassley. And that this was brought forward in the last Congress. It'll be reintroduced in this Congress. And what that does is that provides, reporting requirements that in a non-intrusive way have funds give us basic information about where they're investing, what the categories of investment are, and how many direct jobs they expect to create. And so that'll give us some real indication there about how many operating businesses versus real estate, et cetera. In the absence of that, there are folks doing great work. One of our members, Nova Gradic and Company, they have a great Opportunity Zones working group. And they are probably the lead accounting firm in the Opportunity Zone space. They collect a lot of data directly from funds like our members on where they're investing and what they're investing in. And so Nova Gradic collects a lot of great data, with charts and things like that, that'll give you heat maps on where most of the money's going and what categories it's going into. Each fund that's out there also, in their pitching to bring in the Opportunity Zones capital and those capital gains, they lay out a strategy for whether or not they're going to be investing in Opportunity Zone business, operating businesses or real estate or some mixed combination. And so as a result of that, we have some idea of at least what the intention of the billions of dollars that have been raised so far will be.
Yeah. I remember one of the points that I was hearing when Opportunity Zones first rolled out was that you'd really be able to tell a difference between which states really made the most of Opportunity Zones. Those are the ones that had all the metrics, that coordinated, and also even brought in potentially nonprofits to partner with these funds, maybe even study them as well, figure out what's working, what's not working, how the state can continue to, double down on the right things and not do the wrong things. Shay, President Biden's talked about more federal scrutiny of Opportunity Zones. It sounds like Impact Act is the right way to go. Is there anything else the administration should be changing or not changing?
Well, there are, and Jerron hears me say this all the time, but there are 1,000 ideas on how to improve Opportunity Zones, and 900 of them are bad. And so, when you look at that last 100, probably only 30 of those could pass any Congress. So we focus on that kind of narrower band of potential improvements to the policy. Reporting requirements are at the top of that list. But as we're seeing more uptake in opportunity zones and more understanding and interest, we would personally love, and when I say we, I mean the Opportunity Funds Association and our members, we would love to see to allow governors to designate additional zones within their states. So in the initial bill, they were able to designate 25% of the distressed areas within their states as opportunity zones. We would love to have them be able to designate an additional 10% of zones. We'd also love to have the timeline and time frame for that step up of basis on that initial capital gains investment that Jerron mentioned earlier. We would love to have that extended to provide that incentive for folks who weren't aware of the policy initially, or folks who were kind of waiting for that rulemaking process to play out. And so we would love that, kind of extension. We would also love, and this is getting a little bit into the weeds of the policy, but for the sake of that 100% step up in basis that you get for, or you can look at it as a 100% capital gains elimination on new investments that are made in the zone. So I invest in Hawkins Corp ABC, and I hold that investment in the zone for 10 years. After that 10-year period, when I sell that company to somebody else or I take it public or whatever, there's a 100% elimination of capital gains on there. We would love for that to be able to apply not just to capital gains, but to any investment invested in an opportunity zone. Meaning, if I'm willing to put my capital in an opportunity zone and hold it for 10 years as that business grows and creates jobs, then if I sell that company in 30 years, it would make sense that I get a 100% step up in basis. So those are things that we think we could get bipartisan support for. And those are things that would benefit the existing residents of opportunity zones, with, again, reporting requirements being at the top of that list.
And I hope Congress and the new White House are listening to you. Those are all great ideas. Our audience also mentioned there's the White House Opportunity and Revitalization Council aligning different grants, programs, and agencies that ended, but maybe there's an opportunity to build on that. And also how, HUD reports on best practices. We could also have the federal government perhaps talk about best practices across the country and spread that kind of information. Jerron,
if I could piggyback on that just for a second. So one of the things I actually tried to advise our administration when I was in the Trump administration to do was to make the Revitalization Council statutory. I think the federal government is way overdue with cross-coordinating programs to low-income areas. And so these agencies need to constantly speak together, speak to each other, and there needs to be more flexibility with them. Because someone raised a question earlier about safe communities or access to education dollars. All of that, all those incentives were included through that Revitalization Council. So you had grants going out to localities to deal with things like youth and violence, or charter school grants to build more schools into opportunity zones. And so if you had grants, if you were doing anything as a nonprofit in an opportunity zone, you got a preference point. And you take EDA, for example, they did over 200 different types of investments that totaled over hundreds of millions of dollars into opportunity zones. The same thing with the Department of transportation, as well as the Small Business Administration. And so there's a lot of tools throughout the federal government. And the council was meant to not only show the commitment from the federal government to revitalization of low-income census tracts, it also was to encourage state and local leaders to do something similar. And so if you have that type of alignment on the public sector end, you will start seeing change in these communities like you've never seen it before. And many people were just catching on to it. And so that council, though it was coordinated by HUD, that best practices report included input from all the different agencies, from 22 different agencies. You got input. And that used to be on the website called opportunityzones.gov. And so when individuals were asking about input on impacts and best practices, that report contained what funds were doing the best, what states were doing the best, what cities were doing the best, based off of the transparency and us trying to work with these localities. So hopefully we can bring some of that back, because again, Opportunity Zones and the Revitalization Council came off the backs of what they were doing with Promise Zones, and so I think in order to be a smarter government, you take the things that worked and keep working them so that people are empowered. And this is what this is all about: revitalization of communities that have been left behind for 30 or 40 years.
Well said. Just to play devil's advocate for a moment, or not devil's advocate, but just to say, is there a point where you would say the federal government is going to be doing too much with opportunity zones? Because I keep hearing folks say opportunity zones should be targeted in this way or to that policy priority, not that one. Invest here, not there. Bolster more of this community and less of that. Don't make money this way. Don't do this. Don't do that. But weren't opportunity zones designed to be local, bottom up, let 1,000 flowers bloom? When would you say that's too much?
I mean, that's why we're trying to create ecosystems, and create more flexibility to the local government. We've seen federal incentives. I believe we mentioned it earlier in our conversation. Like, I like the New Markets Tax Credit Program, but it's created a salon industries of just a certain number of companies and organizations can participate in that ecosystem. The same thing with the low income housing tax credit. It's created a salon industry because it's all centralized with the federal government, and those who can lobby the federal government or can get access sometimes win over those individual projects that are on a local level. Opportunity zones allows for flexibility for whatever is a good project. That's why you see a place like Birmingham competing with a place like New York, where you have a lot of people flocking to Birmingham to do investments because they've created the right environment, versus New York, which was a tougher environment. But I think post the election in the Biden administration, I've heard from a lot of big market leaders like in New York or in Chicago that are willing to take a second look at opportunity zones, especially post pandemic. Because everyone's looking at where's the capital, what are my tools, how can I get my economy back up and going? And so a lot of individuals and big companies are saying, like, look, let's take a look at opportunity zones that still exist. And I think that's the direction that the Biden administration is going to go in. He's really talked about leveraging this tool for this revitalization. So it'll be interesting to see where his leadership is going to land on this. But the good thing is we have a lot of data out there that we can analyze. But what I would hope is that we work in a bipartisan basis, come to agreement based off of some of the work that we've done over the last 3 years. There's been a lot of bipartisan conversation. Shay's been in the middle of that. And so I think we can really come together and figure out where are the tweaks so we can really unleash the private sector potential and allow for flexibility on the local level with this economic development incentive.
John, this seems like a great deal for you. One of the questions from our audience is, so what are you hearing locally? What are you hearing from neighbors, businesses with opportunity zones, especially if this continues like it's going?
So one of the things that's been a priority for downtown residents for decades is a grocery store. We have several U.S. Department of Agriculture designated food deserts in our downtown core, which means the residents downtown, who are primarily lower income, have no steady supply of fresh, healthy food. They have to go to corner stores. They have to go to Dollar Generals, Rite Aids, and get their food off the shelves that are prepackaged, that have been boxed, sitting there for a while. And so what we wanted to do, knowing that background and knowing that that was a high priority for the downtown residents, we wanted to figure out a way how we could bring a grocery store to downtown. And thanks to Opportunity Zones, we have acquired a building that was built in the early 1860s. It was primarily vacant. About 80% of it was vacant. We're in the process of turning it around. The upper floors are going to be residential apartments. And on the ground floor, we're going to have a what we call a public market, but it's going to be a fully operating grocery store. And we are working with some great local vendors to operate in that space. We are not required to, by any law or regulation, to force those vendors to accept SNAP, but we are going to ask those vendors to accept SNAP so the residents down here can afford to shop there. And what's unique about this arrangement is it would be too expensive for our market vendors to acquire this building, to turn it around, to buy the equipment. So we are leveraging our capital that was raised by our board and Opportunity Zones to do all the acquisition and development work and to buy the equipment that these market vendors will need to operate inside this grocery store. It's this unique arrangement where we are using private sector capital to address basically a public sector problem, which is downtown is a food desert. And the residents down here are ecstatic about it. I get stopped on the streets asking me when it's going to open, and we can't move along with construction fast enough. So I think that's a great example of the promise of Opportunity Zones.
And when you hear Jaron and Shay talk about what the Biden administration may do, should do, do you agree with what they're saying? Or are there things that you would really hope for from the state level or the federal level that you're not seeing so far? Or maybe what your local neighbors are saying as well?
Absolutely. I mean, 100% agreement with them, but I actually would double down on the program itself. And actually, I think there needs to be a greater incentive for communities like Erie, because it's been a struggle to get the capital that we are getting to Erie, the Opportunity Zone capital. I think the only reason we've been successful is because our board raised $27 million to start this work. And part of the arrangement, and I think Jaron mentioned it earlier, Shay mentioned it, the role of philanthropy and nonprofits. I've got to give a big credit to our community foundation, the Community Foundation. We have Arcturus Impact Investors out of Boston investing in some of these projects. Arcturus has made a commitment of $40 million to Opportunity Zone projects across the city. And they've got basically a backstop from the Community Foundation of $5 million on these investments. These are really difficult environments to invest in. Just to give you an example, we are spending close to $24 million to acquire and revitalize a building. The most recent appraisal came back at $7 million. So when you look at the Opportunity Zone incentive, with that building, it's not big enough. You have to either increase that incentive, or you've got to find some other capital to attract this Opportunity Zone capital. And so as the new administration looks at the program, I would say that they need to double down on it. The folks hit upon this earlier, but there's never been a new markets tax credit deal here in Erie. It's a jobs program, but it's a jobs program for lawyers and accountants and consultants who are not in places like Erie, Pennsylvania. And I would shift away from those types of programs, which are run out of DC, and I would lean more towards Opportunity Zones, where it gives so much flexibility to people on the ground who know their communities the best.
And Shay, just a very specific question to you based on what John was saying. It seems like there is a difference between how Opportunity Zones would work between distressed areas kind of in declining regions, or ones that have been struggling for a while, where property values are low or have been declining, or in the difference between kind of low-income zones in areas that are otherwise very wealthy. And maybe there's also a difference too between urban and rural Opportunity Zones,
yeah, absolutely.
as an audience member asked, right?
Yeah, no question. So if you're in Brooklyn, New York, then in a distressed area, then you have to worry about things like potential gentrification, because those places are already on a gentrification trend. Whereas here in Cleveland, you could double Cleveland's population and not have one person have to move, because they've been displaced. And so, so we see those differences. We see, the urban areas, obviously, again, as Jerron mentioned in the early stages, a lot of real estate. In rural areas, you see a lot of operating businesses. And so, there are sort of regional differences, but that's why that flexibility was built in, to allow governors first to select the zones based on, the various needs across their state. But then also in building on the incentive, to have that local and state control in the process, because what's going to work in South Carolina is not going to be what's going to work in Ohio. And that's not going to necessarily work in New York or Illinois.
Great point. All right. So quick round robin. I'll start with you, Shay, and then John and Jerron. What do you hope to see in 10 years from opportunity zones? First to you, Shay.
I hope to see 100 billion with a B in investment in opportunity zones that spread as evenly as possible across this great country. And I hope to see that investment benefit from an economic standpoint and a quality of life standpoint the existing residents of these zones.
John?
Here in Erie, we've lost population and jobs every year for the last 60 years. So in 10 years' time, I hope that we will have seen an increase of population and jobs, and that when historians are studying the turnaround of the city, that they can pinpoint it to this moment when opportunity zones aligned with our work and the work of our community leaders to spark this revitalization.
Jerron?
I hope to see these areas that have been designated opportunity zones no longer be opportunity zones, and be areas that haven't been displacing people, but have shared prosperity for the individuals who live in those zones. If we could go area code by area code and lift all boats across America, the best is yet to come on what we can add to the global competitiveness of our country.
Let's aim for that. The best is indeed yet to come. Thank you all so much. Thank you to our audience for being a part of this conversation on opportunity zones in America. And I hope that you'll continue to be part of this push for more opportunity in this country. Thank you very much. And please tune again next time for our future events at the Manhattan Institute. Thank you.